He stood in the courtroom, trembling but determined, clutching a battered notebook. Across the aisle, the smug landlord smirked, confident of his victory. But when a janitor presented a dusty security tape, everything changed. The evidence revealed a shocking truth, leaving the courtroom stunned. What happened next, no one could have predicted. Let's start from the beginning. Before we dive into this gripping courtroom drama, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling legal battles, untold stories of justice, and jaw-dropping courtroom moments every day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Justice has never been this intense. The courtroom, dimly lit by the overcast sky streaming through tall windows, felt both cavernous and suffocating. The quiet murmurs of the small audience settled into an anticipatory hush as Judge Marshall, an imposing figure in his black robes, called the next case. 11-year-old Ethan Harper sat at the defendant's table, dwarfed not only by the room's grandeur, but also by the legal professionals surrounding him. His feet barely touched the ground, and his trembling hands clutched a weathered notebook as though it were a shield against the onslaught of scrutiny he was about to face. Across the aisle stood Gerard Langston, a man whose mere presence commanded attention. The gleaming watch on his wrist and the sharp cut of his designer suit marked him as someone who expected to win. He exuded the air of a predator circling easy prey, a confident smirk playing on his lips as he leaned toward his attorney, Ms. Caldwell. She whispered something back to him, her tone condescending, her glance flickering briefly toward Ethan with a mix of pity and disdain. Langston had accused Ethan's family of failing to pay rent for months, resulting in their eviction. To many in the courtroom, it seemed like an open and shut case. But Ethan knew the truth, and he was determined to reveal it. His mother, Sarah Harper, had painstakingly paid cash directly to Langston every month. She had trusted him, taking him at his word when he claimed receipts weren't necessary. Now, bedridden from illness and unable to defend herself, she had left everything in the hands of her son, a boy thrust into the unforgiving arena of a courtroom. Judge Marshall leaned forward, his heavy brows knitting together as he scanned the file before him. His voice, low and gravelly, echoed in the silent room. "You're representing your family today, young man?" Ethan straightened his back, though his legs shook beneath the table. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice wavering but resolute. He held the judge's gaze, refusing to let his fear show. He was all his family had, and he wasn't going to let them down. The judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. "A serious matter for someone so young. Do you understand what's at stake here?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. "I do." Across the aisle, Langston exchanged an amused glance with Ms. Caldwell. She smirked, adjusting her tailored blazer as she rose to her feet. "Your Honor, I'd like to state for the record that this is highly irregular. My client has followed all legal protocols, and the evidence will clearly show that this child's accusations are baseless." Ethan flinched at her words, but held his ground. His small frame seemed to shrink further under the weight of Langston's glare, but the fire in his eyes didn't falter. He opened the notebook, its pages worn and crinkled, and placed it on the table in front of him. Inside were months of handwritten notes, carefully recorded by his mother, dates, amounts, and every payment she had made. The judge waved a hand. "Ms. Caldwell, you'll have your turn. Let the boy speak." Caldwell shot Ethan a look of contempt, but sat down, crossing her legs as she whispered something to Langston, who chuckled quietly. Ethan took a deep breath, the air around him feeling heavier with every passing second. He stood, his knees barely visible above the edge of the table, and faced the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trembling but clear. "My mom always paid Mr. Langston. She gave him cash every month, just like he asked. She trusted him because she thought he was an honest man. But now, he's saying we didn't pay anything, and that's not true. I have proof." He gestured to the notebook, his small hand hovering protectively over it. Langston's confident smirk twisted into a sneer. "Proof? A notebook?" He leaned forward, his tone dripping with mockery. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a child's scribbles, hardly admissible in court." Ethan turned to him, his voice rising despite the lump in his throat. "It's not just scribbles. My mom wrote down every payment she made, every single one. You told her receipts weren't necessary, and now you're trying to use that against us." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the tension rising like a storm gathering strength. Judge Marshall raised his gavel, the sharp crack silencing the room. "Order! Mr. Langston, you will not interrupt the defendant. Young man, continue." Ethan swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the notebook as if to draw strength from it. "My mom trusted Mr. Langston, and now we've lost our home because of his lies. I just want to prove the truth." Judge Marshall leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Ethan. "You mentioned proof. This notebook, does it contain detailed records?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It has all the dates and amounts we paid." The judge gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the notebook. Ethan hesitated for a moment before handing it over, his fingers brushing against the worn cover one last time. The bailiff brought it to the judge, who opened it and began flipping through the pages. The room held its breath as his expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue. "These entries are detailed," the judge muttered, mostly to himself. He looked up, his gaze piercing Langston. "Mr. Langston, do you have any records contradicting these claims?" Langston's smug demeanor wavered ever so slightly. "I don't keep records for cash payments," he said, his voice tight. "I prefer checks or transfers. I've made that clear to all my tenants." Ethan shook his head vehemently. "That's not true. You told my mom cash was fine." Langston glared at him, his jaw tightening. "Watch your tone, boy." Judge Marshall's gavel slammed down once more. "Mr. Langston, I will not tolerate intimidation in this courtroom." He turned to Ethan. "Thank you for your statement. We'll review this evidence." Ethan sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. The room buzzed with a mix of tension and curiosity, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Ethan glanced toward Langston, who was now whispering furiously to his attorney. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the tycoon's face. The battle was far from over, but Ethan had taken the first step, and the courtroom knew it. Ethan's voice echoed through the courtroom, each word a trembling but determined declaration of his family's innocence. "Your Honor, my family always paid Mr. Langston. My mom handed him cash, but he never gave us receipts. He's lying about us missing payments." A hushed silence hung in the air for a moment before Miss Caldwell, Langston's sharp-tongued attorney, stood abruptly. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound somehow amplifying her disdain. "Your Honor," she began, her voice laced with mockery, "the idea that my client, a respected businessman, would falsify such claims is absurd. This child has no evidence to support his baseless accusations." The courtroom chuckled in quiet agreement, the sound a painful reminder to Ethan of just how outnumbered he was. His face flushed a deep red, and he gripped the edge of the table for support, his confidence momentarily shaken. But before he could falter entirely, Judge Marshall's gavel struck the wooden bench with a sharp crack. "Order in the court!" the judge barked, his voice cutting through the low hum of laughter. He turned his stern gaze toward Ethan. "Young man, do you have proof to support your claim?" Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the weathered notebook in front of him. The leather cover, worn smooth by years of handling, felt like the only solid thing in the room. Slowly, he held it up, his voice quiet but resolute. "I do, Your Honor. My mom kept notes of every payment." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably, The amused smirks and dismissive glances were replaced by curiosity, even a flicker of doubt. Langston's smug grin faltered for the first time, his confident posture stiffening as he leaned toward Ms. Caldwell. Their whispered exchange was too quiet to hear, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Judge Marshall gestured for the bailiff to retrieve the notebook. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before handing it over, his fingers brushing the frayed edges one last time. The bailiff carried it to the judge, who opened it carefully, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. "These entries are meticulous," Judge Marshall muttered, flipping through the notebook. "Dates, amounts, even notes about conversations. This is far from baseless." He looked up, his eyes narrowing at Langston. "Mr. Langston, do you have any records to contradict these claims?" Langston straightened, his expression hardening. "I don't keep records for cash payments," he replied, his tone defensive. "I prefer checks or transfers, as is standard for professional dealings. I've made that clear to all my tenants." Ethan couldn't stay silent any longer. "That's not true," he said, his voice rising with emotion. "You told my mom that cash was fine. She trusted you, and now you're using that against us." Langston's eyes narrowed into a glare. "Watch your tone, boy," he snapped, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the anger simmering beneath his polished facade. Judge Marshall's gavel struck again, the sound reverberating through the room. "Mr. Langston, you will not intimidate the defendant in my courtroom," he said firmly. "Young man, continue." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "My mom always wrote down every payment she gave him. It's all there in the notebook." He turned toward the judge, his voice trembling but insistent. "We've never missed a payment. He's the one lying." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he closed the notebook and placed it on his bench. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs, the tide of opinion slowly beginning to shift. Ethan's claim had planted a seed of doubt, and now all eyes were on Langston. Ms. Caldwell rose to her feet, her sharp features tight with barely concealed frustration. "Your Honor, while I respect the effort this child has put into his argument, this so-called evidence is hardly admissible. A handwritten notebook cannot be verified and proves nothing." Ethan turned to face her, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It's not just a notebook," he said, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. "It's the truth. My mom trusted Mr. Langston, and he betrayed that trust." The courtroom stilled, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Even Judge Marshall seemed momentarily struck by the boy's conviction. He glanced toward Ms. Caldwell, raising a hand to silence her before she could respond. "We'll determine the validity of this evidence in due course," the judge said firmly. He turned back to Ethan. "Do you have anything else to add, young man?" Ethan shook his head, his energy spent. "No, Your Honor, that's all." Judge Marshall nodded. "Very well. We'll take a short recess before continuing." The courtroom erupted into whispers as the judge banged his gavel and rose from his seat. Langston and Ms. Caldwell huddled together, their hushed conversation tense and animated. Across the room, Ethan sank into his chair, his small frame trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He glanced at the notebook still sitting on the judge's bench, the pages containing not just his mother's careful records, but the hopes of his family. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he allowed himself to believe they might have a chance. As the audience filed out for the recess, Ethan stayed in his seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The battle was far from over, but the doubt in Langston's eyes gave him something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Ethan carefully placed the weathered notebook on the evidence table, his small hands lingering on the frayed edges for just a moment. It was more than just a collection of notes. It was the only tangible proof his family had. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the court with a steadiness that defied the storm of emotions brewing within him. "This has all the dates and amounts we paid," he said, his voice clear despite the tremble threatening to creep in. "My mom wrote everything down." Ms. Caldwell, seated beside Langston with an air of practiced arrogance, rose slowly to her feet. She let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes as though the effort of entertaining Ethan's claim was beneath her. "A handwritten notebook?" she scoffed, her tone dripping with derision. "Your Honor, this is laughable. We're expected to take a child's scribbled notes as credible evidence?" Ethan's face flushed with indignation, but before he could speak, Judge Marshall raised his hand, his expression sharp and unyielding. "Let's examine it before dismissing it, Ms. Caldwell." His voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs rippling through the courtroom. The bailiff retrieved the notebook and handed it to the judge. As Judge Marshall opened it, the courtroom fell into an expectant silence, the tension almost palpable. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. The faint scratch of paper was the only sound as the judge's eyes scanned the careful entries, one by one. "These entries are meticulous," Judge Marshall finally said, his voice tinged with a note of surprise. He held the notebook up slightly, showing the courtroom the neat handwriting, each date and amount recorded with precision. Every payment is accounted for, and the notes even include descriptions of conversations. For a moment, the courtroom felt like it was holding its collective breath. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched Langston, whose smug confidence began to falter. But then, as though flipping a switch, Langston straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and forced a smirk back onto his face. "I don't keep cash payment records," Langston said smoothly, his voice calm but firm. "My clients know that checks or transfers are preferred. That has always been my policy." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't stay silent. "That's not true," he burst out, his voice rising with frustration. "He told my mom cash was fine. He said he didn't need to bother with receipts." The room stirred again, the quiet murmurs building as Langston's polished veneer began to crack. Langston turned slowly to glare at Ethan, his eyes cold and calculating. "Watch your tone, boy," he said, his words low and edged with menace. Judge Marshall's gavel came down with a sharp crack, commanding attention. "Mr. Langston," the judge said sternly, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a knife. "I will not tolerate intimidation in my courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Langston hesitated, the weight of the judge's words pressing down on him, before nodding curtly. "Crystal clear, Your Honor." Judge Marshall turned his attention back to Ethan. "Young man, do you have anything else to add about these records?" Ethan took a steadying breath. "Just that my mom trusted him, Your Honor. She trusted him when he said cash was fine, and now he's trying to use that against us." His voice wavered slightly, but he forced himself to meet the judge's gaze. "I just want to prove the truth." The judge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He glanced toward Ms. Caldwell, who was already on her feet, ready to pounce. "Your Honor," she began, her tone clipped and authoritative. "As my client has stated, he has always preferred formal payment methods. A handwritten notebook, while detailed, is hardly verifiable evidence. We have no way of knowing whether these entries are accurate or fabricated after the fact." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a mix of agreement and skepticism filling the space. Judge Marshall silenced them with another sharp bang of his gavel. "Ms. Caldwell, I appreciate your input, but it is this court's job to weigh the evidence, not dismiss it outright." He fixed her with a pointed stare before returning his attention to Langston. "Mr. Langston, if cash payments were made, as the defendant claims, why were no receipts issued?" Langston's jaw tightened, his smirk now a shadow of its former self. "It wasn't necessary," he replied, his words carefully measured. "Most tenants don't request receipts for cash payments. It's a common understanding." Ethan couldn't help but interject again. "But we did ask," he said, his voice louder now, fueled by a sense of desperation. "My mom asked for receipts, and he said they weren't needed. He promised everything was fine." Langston's face darkened, and Ms. Caldwell quickly stepped in to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "this is becoming a circus. My client has explained his practices clearly. We shouldn't be entertaining baseless accusations from a child." Judge Marshall held up a hand to silence her. "The court will decide what is baseless and what is not," he said firmly. He gestured toward the bailiff. "The notebook will be admitted as evidence for further review." Langston's composed demeanor was starting to fray at the edges, his clenched fists resting on the table. Ethan, meanwhile, sat back in his chair, his heart still racing but bolstered by the judge's decision to consider the notebook. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step forward, and for the first time the courtroom felt just a little less stacked against him. As Judge Marshall set the notebook aside, the room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone in the room, from the spectators to the legal professionals, could feel the momentum shifting, and for the first time, Langston looked less like an untouchable tycoon and more like a man caught in a storm he hadn't prepared for. Ethan allowed himself a small, fleeting glimmer of hope. The battle wasn't over, but he had made his move. The courtroom was filled with an uneasy silence as Judge Marshall reviewed the arguments, his sharp gaze shifting between Ethan, Langston, and the notebook resting on the evidence table. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, with every spectator holding their breath, waiting for the next twist in the case. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, interrupting the quiet deliberation. Heads turned as a janitor, dressed in a simple uniform and clutching a small object, hesitated in the doorway. His nervous expression and hesitant steps only added to the intrigue. "Your Honor," the janitor began, his voice shaky but resolute. "I overheard the case, and I might have something to add." A wave of whispers rippled through the room like an electric current. Ms. Caldwell shot to her feet, her sharp features contorting in indignation. "This is highly irregular," she snapped, glaring at the intruder. "He has no business interrupting court proceedings." Judge Marshall's gavel came down with a decisive crack, silencing both Caldwell and the growing murmur of the audience. His expression remained stern as he gestured for the janitor to step forward. "This is a court of law, Ms. Caldwell, not a circus. Let the man speak." The janitor, whose name tag read Mr. Reeves, approached the front of the courtroom cautiously, his eyes flickering toward Langston, who sat rigid and pale at the plaintiff's table. I clean Mr. Langston's office building," Reeves began, his voice trembling slightly. He held up a small plastic cassette. "Last month I found this security tape while I was cleaning his office. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after hearing this case, I realized it might be important." Langston's composed facade wavered, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. He adjusted his tie with shaking hands, his confidence visibly cracking. "This is absurd," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow. "Your Honor, are we really going to entertain this nonsense?" Judge Marshall ignored him, turning his full attention to Reeves. "What's on the tape, Mr. Reeves?" The janitor swallowed hard before answering. "It shows Mr. Langston accepting cash payments from several tenants. He didn't write receipts for any of them." Gasps erupted from the spectators, the sudden revelation sending shockwaves through the courtroom. Even Ethan's eyes widened as he sat up straighter, his earlier exhaustion replaced by a flicker of hope. Langston, on the other hand, had gone pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is a baseless stunt," Ms. Caldwell interjected, her voice rising with frustration. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is unverified and irrelevant. There's no proof it pertains to this case or my client's dealings with the Harper family." Judge Marshall raised a hand to silence her once more. "We'll determine its relevance after reviewing it," he said firmly, gesturing for the bailiff to retrieve the tape. "Mr. Reeves, you're certain this footage shows Mr. Langston receiving cash payments from tenants?" "Yes, Your Honor." Reeves said, his voice steadying now that he had taken the plunge. The dates on the tape match some of the entries in that notebook the boy brought. Langston bolted upright from his seat, his earlier veneer of calm shattering. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice louder and more aggressive than anyone had heard all day. "How dare you bring in some lowly janitor with a tape that could have been tampered with? I demand this farce end immediately." Judge Marshall's gavel slammed down again, his tone unyielding. "Sit down, Mr. Langston, or I'll have you removed from this courtroom. You'll have your chance to respond." Langston sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath, his lawyer leaning over to whisper urgently in his ear. The smirk that had carried him so far in the case was long gone, replaced by a tense scowl. The bailiff inserted the tape into a monitor set up for evidence review. The grainy footage began to play, showing the inside of Langston's office, a polished, professional space. The room watched in rapt silence as the screen showed Langston himself, seated at his desk, taking thick stacks of cash from various tenants. Each exchange ended with him pocketing the money and dismissing the tenants with a wave, no receipts in sight. Ethan's breath caught as he watched the screen, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. This was it. Proof of the very thing Langston had spent the entire trial denying. Langston's expression turned from anger to something bordering on desperation. "This is irrelevant," he shouted, standing once again. "These people have nothing to do with this case. Their payments don't prove anything about the Harpers." Ms. Caldwell stood as well, trying to regain control of the spiraling situation. "Your Honor, I object to this line of evidence. It's speculative at best and prejudicial at worst." Judge Marshall held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Objection noted, Ms. Caldwell. However, the tape raises questions about Mr. Langston's credibility and practices. We'll proceed accordingly." Ethan couldn't suppress a small smile. For the first time, Langston's untouchable image had been punctured. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and exchanged glances, the tide clearly turning against Langston. Reeves stepped back, his shoulders sagging with relief as his part in the unfolding drama came to an end. Judge Marshall turned to him. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Your courage in bringing this forward is noted." As Reeves nodded and stepped aside, Ethan's confidence surged. The courtroom no longer felt as overwhelmingly one-sided. Langston's composed arrogance had crumbled, and Ethan could feel the scales tipping in favor of the truth. Still, he knew the fight wasn't over. The next step would be just as critical, but for now, the cracks in Langston's carefully constructed facade were more than enough. The courtroom was silent as the bailiff pressed play on the tape, the faint hum of the machine the only sound. All eyes turned to the monitor at the front of the room, where grainy black and white footage began to flicker to life. The image was unmistakable. Langston himself, seated at his opulent desk, his tailored suit impeccable even in low-resolution video. On the screen, tenant after tenant entered the frame, holding out stacks of cash. Langston took the money, his movements smooth and practiced. Not once did he issue a receipt. Instead, the cash disappeared into his desk drawer or the pocket of his expensive suit jacket. The pattern repeated several times, each interaction eerily similar. As the minutes ticked by, the evidence piled higher, a silent accusation that echoed louder with each transaction. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. The murmurs that followed grew louder as spectators exchanged shocked glances, the weight of the evidence impossible to ignore. Ethan sat frozen, his wide eyes fixed on the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the proof they needed. Langston, who had been sitting rigidly at his table, visibly paled. His carefully maintained facade of confidence cracked as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He adjusted his tie, his hands shaking slightly, and leaned toward Ms. Caldwell, whispering something urgently. Caldwell stood abruptly, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the bench. Her usual air of controlled arrogance was now tinged with urgency. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp and commanding. "This tape is purely circumstantial. There is no direct link between the transactions shown and the Harper's case. This evidence does not prove that my client acted dishonestly toward the defendant's family." Her words were quick, calculated, but the undertone of unease was impossible to miss. Caldwell's confidence seemed less certain now, more like a shield hastily raised against an attack she hadn't anticipated. Ethan's voice, small but resolute, cut through the rising noise in the room. "It proves he lies," he said, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at Langston. "Just like he lied about us." The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with truth. The murmurs in the courtroom stilled as all eyes turned back to Langston, who now looked like a man cornered. His jaw tightened, and his hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The usually unflappable property tycoon was unraveling before their eyes. Judge Marshall, his expression grave, leaned forward. "Ms. Caldwell, the footage may not be directly tied to this case, but it raises serious questions about your client's business practices. It speaks to a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored." Caldwell bristled but managed to keep her composure. "Your Honor, even if this tape shows my client accepting cash payments without issuing receipts, it does not establish wrongdoing. Many landlords operate in cash to accommodate their tenants. This could be standard practice." Ethan couldn't stay silent. Standard practice? Then why didn't he say that earlier? His voice, though young, carried a sharpness that silenced the room. "If he's not doing anything wrong, why did he tell my mom not to ask for receipts? Why does he look so nervous now?" Langston's expression darkened further, his carefully constructed image of control slipping away with every word from Ethan's mouth. He shifted again in his chair, his discomfort visible as he avoided meeting the judge's gaze. Caldwell turned to Ethan, her tone condescending. "With all due respect, young man, speculation doesn't hold up in court. Unless you have concrete evidence that ties these payments to your family's situation, this line of argument is irrelevant." Ethan straightened in his seat, his small frame radiating determination. "It's not speculation," he said firmly. "That tape shows who he really is. If he can lie to all those people, why wouldn't he lie about us?" The words struck a chord. The spectators in the gallery murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder as they processed the undeniable logic in Ethan's argument. Even Judge Marshall appeared to be weighing the boy's words carefully, his fingers steepled under his chin as he considered the implications. Langston couldn't hold back any longer. "This is outrageous!" he burst out, slamming his hands on the table. His voice, once smooth and controlled, was now rough and defensive. "I don't have to explain myself to a child. This whole thing is a waste of time." Judge Marshall's gavel came down with a resounding crack. "Mr. Langston, control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Langston sank back into his seat, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The confidence he had displayed at the start of the trial was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a simmering frustration that only further eroded his credibility. Ethan watched Langston closely, his heart pounding. The power dynamics in the room were shifting. Langston, once untouchable, was now scrambling to protect himself. For the first time, Ethan felt the faintest glimmer of hope that the truth might prevail. Judge Marshall turned to Ms. Caldwell. "The court will consider this tape as evidence of Mr. Langston's practices. While it may not be conclusive on its own, it contributes to a broader picture of behavior that warrants scrutiny." Caldwell opened her mouth to object, but hesitated. She glanced at Langston, whose pale, tense face offered no reassurance. Instead, she nodded stiffly and returned to her seat, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. As the judge ordered the tape to be entered into evidence, the courtroom buzzed with energy. The tide was turning, and everyone in the room could feel it. Ethan sat back in his chair, his hands still trembling but his resolve stronger than ever. The cracks in Langston's armor were widening, and with every step forward, the truth was becoming harder to deny. Langston's composure, once the foundation of his courtroom dominance, shattered in an instant. He shot up from his seat, slamming his palms against the polished wood of the plaintiff's table. The loud thud echoed through the tense silence of the courtroom, drawing startled gasps from the audience. His voice, no longer smooth and measured, erupted with frustration.
"This is ridiculous. I don't have to defend myself against a child and a janitor."
The outburst lingered in the air, its venomous tone starkly at odds with the decorum expected in the room. Judge Marshall's piercing glare silenced the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the gallery. He leaned forward, his expression icy, and spoke with measured authority. "You'll maintain decorum in my courtroom, Mr. Langston. If you can't control yourself, I'll have you removed." Langston froze, his jaw tightening as he slowly sank back into his chair. His confident facade, already frayed at the edges, now lay in tatters. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, felt a surge of courage. The cracks in Langston's demeanor emboldened him. He sat up straighter, his small voice cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. "Why don't you show us your financial records, Mr. Langston?" he asked, his tone steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Unless you're hiding something." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The courtroom erupted into murmurs once more, the spectators exchanging glances filled with intrigue and disbelief. Ethan's suggestion had hit a nerve, and everyone knew it. Langston's face darkened, his carefully maintained mask slipping further. His lawyer, Miss Caldwell, immediately leaned toward him, her voice a sharp whisper. Whatever she was saying seemed urgent, but Langston's clenched jaw and tight grip on the edge of the table suggested he wasn't entirely receptive. The damage was already done. Ethan's question had planted a seed of doubt, and it was growing rapidly. The courtroom was no longer a place where Langston's word was absolute. His refusal to answer the boy's straightforward challenge only deepened the sense of unease spreading through the room. Judge Marshall observed the exchange, his sharp gaze flickering between Langston and Ethan. He tapped his gavel lightly, a gesture not of force but of control. "Mr. Langston," he said, his tone even but firm, "the defendant has raised a valid point. If you claim your financial practices are above reproach, then producing your records should be a simple matter." Langston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands tightening into fists. For a man who had spent years towering over others in his business dealings, the scrutiny now directed at him was unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. "My financial records are private," he said finally, his voice strained. "I don't see why I should have to share them here." Ethan didn't miss a beat. "Because they'll show the truth," he countered, his voice growing stronger with each word. "If you've got nothing to hide, then what's the problem?" The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, the spectators clearly captivated by the unexpected turn of events. The once unshakable Langston was now visibly rattled, and Ethan's quiet determination was becoming impossible to dismiss. Caldwell rose to her feet, her expression sharp as she sought to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a diversion. My client's financial records are irrelevant to this case. The defendant is grasping at straws." Judge Marshall raised a hand to silence her. "Ms. Caldwell, I'll determine what is and isn't relevant in my courtroom. If there's reason to believe these records could provide clarity on the matter at hand, I see no harm in requesting them." Langston's pale face turned a deeper shade of red, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He leaned toward Caldwell, whispering something heatedly, but she shook her head, her expression grim. The dynamic between them had shifted. The once dominant Langston now seemed desperate, his authority slipping through his fingers. Ethan watched the exchange, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was pushing boundaries, but he also knew he was right. Langston's refusal to provide his records only made him look guiltier, and the boy wasn't about to let the opportunity slip away. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice breaking through the rising tension. "If he's telling the truth, his records would prove it. But if he's not..." He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Judge Marshall regarded Ethan with a measured expression before turning his attention back to Langston. "Mr. Langston, the court is well within its rights to request documentation that could shed light on this matter. If you have nothing to hide, there should be no reason to withhold your records." Langston's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. The gallery was silent now, every spectator hanging on his next move. Caldwell placed a hand on his arm, her expression pleading, but Langston jerked away from her touch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "This is a waste of time," he spat, his voice thick with barely concealed rage. "I'm not going to humor these baseless accusations any longer." The refusal landed like a thunderclap in the silent courtroom. The murmurs that followed were no longer whispers. They were full-blown conversations, the audience's doubt and suspicion now impossible to ignore. Judge Marshall banged his gavel, restoring order with a sharp glare. "Very well, Mr. Langston," he said, his tone cold. "The court will take your unwillingness to comply into consideration as we proceed." Langston sank back into his chair, his expression a mixture of fury and defeat. Ethan, on the other hand, felt a surge of quiet triumph. The battle wasn't over, but Langston's refusal to provide his records was a crack in his armor, a crack that Ethan was determined to widen. The courtroom, once a cacophony of debate, now fell into a tense silence as Judge Marshall prepared to deliver his verdict. Hours of testimony, evidence, and heated exchanges had led to this pivotal moment. Ethan Harper, sitting at the defense table, gripped the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His weathered notebook rested in front of him, the symbol of his family's struggle, now pivotal evidence in their case. Judge Marshall's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Ethan's determined yet exhausted face, then shifting to Gerard Langston, whose once impeccable confidence had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Langston sat stiffly, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the judge, but the faint sheen of sweat on his brow betrayed his discomfort. Clearing his throat, the judge leaned forward, his voice cutting through the thick tension like a knife. "The evidence is clear," he began, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning. "Ethan Harper has demonstrated that his family paid their rent, and Mr. Langston has acted dishonestly." The gallery erupted into cheers, the spectators unable to contain their relief and triumph. Ethan's small, quiet victory had become a communal moment of justice, a testament to the resilience of truth. People clapped, some even rising to their feet, their voices echoing off the courtroom's high ceilings. Judge Marshall, unamused by the outburst, banged his gavel sharply. "Order in the court!" he barked, his stern tone cutting through the jubilation. The gallery quieted, though the smiles and murmurs of satisfaction remained palpable. Turning back to Langston, Judge Marshall's expression hardened. "Mr. Langston, your actions have shown a blatant disregard for the law and for the trust placed in you by your tenants. You are hereby fined for fraudulent practices, and this eviction is nullified. Effective immediately, the Harper family is entitled to remain in their home." Langston's face turned ashen, his once proud demeanor utterly shattered. He attempted to rise, perhaps to argue, but Ms. Caldwell placed a firm hand on his arm, silently urging him to sit back down. There was nothing left to say. The truth had prevailed, and his empire of deceit had finally crumbled. At the defense table, Ethan exhaled deeply, as though he had been holding his breath for the entire trial. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the scene before him. For weeks he had carried the weight of his family's fate on his small shoulders, enduring the doubt and condescension of nearly everyone around him. And now, against all odds, he had won. Judge Marshall addressed Ethan directly, his voice softening. "Young man, your courage and determination in the face of great adversity are commendable. You've shown this court and everyone here what it means to fight for what's right." Ethan nodded, unable to find his voice. The judge's words felt like a balm to his frayed nerves, a recognition of the immense burden he had shouldered. His gaze flickered to the gallery, where strangers offered him nods of respect and murmured words of encouragement. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the oppressive weight of fear and uncertainty begin to lift. Langston, on the other hand, sat in stunned silence, his face a portrait of disbelief and indignation. The fine imposed by the court was a blow to his reputation, but the real damage lay in the public exposure of his dishonest practices. The gallery's disapproval was palpable. Murmurs of outrage at Langston's actions rippled through the room, a stark contrast to the support directed at Ethan. Ms. Caldwell leaned over to whisper to her client, her tone urgent but measured. Langston shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight, bitter line. He seemed to realize there was no salvaging his image, at least not today. As the judge concluded the session and rose from his seat, the spectators began to file out, their conversations buzzing with the dramatic events they had witnessed. Ethan remained seated, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. He glanced at the judge's bench one last time, the magnitude of what had just happened finally sinking in. Justice had been served, and his family's honor restored. A hand gently touched his shoulder, and Ethan turned to see a kind-faced man from the gallery, a stranger who had been among the first to cheer when the verdict was delivered. "You're a brave kid," the man said, his voice warm. "What you did today, it mattered." Ethan smiled through his tears, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and pride. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, Ethan caught sight of Langston, who was being approached by reporters just outside the courtroom doors. Their cameras flashed as they bombarded him with questions, their voices sharp and insistent. Langston's attempts to shield his face only made the scene more chaotic, his downfall now on full display for all to see. Ethan didn't linger. The victory wasn't about Langston's humiliation. It was about his family. He walked toward the exit, the notebook still clutched tightly to his chest. The air outside the courthouse was crisp and cool, the weight of the courtroom replaced by a newfound lightness. He looked up at the sky, its expanse a reminder that life, though filled with challenges, always held room for hope. Waiting on the steps was a small crowd of onlookers, some of whom began to applaud as Ethan emerged. Their faces, filled with admiration and encouragement, blurred as Ethan wiped at his eyes. He didn't know these people, but their support warmed him nonetheless. Standing at the bottom of the steps was a familiar figure, his mother. Despite her frail appearance, she stood tall, her arms open wide as Ethan ran into them. "You did it, Ethan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it." "I just told the truth," he said, burying his face in her shoulder. "And that," she replied, "was enough." For Ethan Harper, the battle had been long and harrowing, but as he walked home with his mother that day, he carried with him a sense of triumph far greater than the courtroom victory itself. Justice wasn't just served, it was earned, and it belonged to the smallest yet strongest voice in the room. As the courtroom began to empty, the once tense atmosphere melted into a warm hum of celebration and admiration. Ethan Harper, still seated at the defense table, was overcome by the whirlwind of emotions. Relief, pride, and exhaustion all collided within him, making it difficult to fully grasp the gravity of what had just happened. The notebook, worn and weathered from weeks of his mother's careful record-keeping and his own trembling hands, rested on the table before him, a symbol of their victory. The first stranger approached him hesitantly, an older woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. "You're a remarkable young man," she said, extending her hand. "What you did today took courage most adults can't muster." Ethan blinked, unsure how to respond, and simply shook her hand, managing a quiet, "Thank you." Her words felt surreal, as if she were speaking about someone else entirely. But soon, others followed, each person eager to shake his hand, offer words of admiration, or simply smile in support. A middle-aged man patted him on the shoulder. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, kid. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Even the bailiff, a usually stoic figure, nodded at him with quiet respect as he cleared the courtroom. "You did good, son," he murmured, his voice gruff but kind. Ethan barely had time to process the encouragement before Judge Marshall, having just removed his glasses and packed up his papers, walked over. The judge rarely lingered after a case, his reputation as a no-nonsense professional preceding him. But today was different. Judge Marshall paused in front of Ethan, his expression softer than anyone in the room had likely ever seen. "Young man," he began, his voice steady and firm, but not without warmth. "You've shown remarkable bravery, not just for standing up in this courtroom, but for doing so with integrity and respect. Your mother would be very proud." Ethan felt his throat tighten, and he nodded quickly, unable to find the words to respond. Judge Marshall placed a hand on his shoulder briefly before straightening and walking toward his chambers, leaving behind a boy who now carried the weight of the judge's rare praise like a medal of honor. Across the room, Gerard Langston was a stark contrast to the hopeful energy that surrounded Ethan. He stormed out of the courtroom, his polished shoes echoing angrily against the floor, his lawyer trailing behind him in a flurry of whispered frustration. Langston's carefully constructed image of power and authority had been shattered, and the weight of public shame followed him with every step. He didn't glance back at Ethan, nor did anyone in the room offer him a shred of sympathy. Ethan watched Langston's retreating figure for a moment, his expression unreadable. The victory wasn't about Langston's humiliation. It never had been. For Ethan, the fight was always about his family, his home, and the truth. Finally, he rose from his chair, his legs trembling slightly from the emotional toll of the day. He reached for the notebook, cradling it against his chest as though it were a trophy. It wasn't much to look at. Its edges were frayed, the pages dog-eared and worn. But to Ethan, it was everything. It was proof of his mother's hard work, his family's perseverance, and their refusal to be silenced. Walking toward the exit, Ethan felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in weeks. The courtroom, once an intimidating battlefield, now felt smaller, less foreboding. The battle was over, and he had emerged victorious, not through brute force or cunning manipulation, but through truth and determination. As he pushed open the heavy courthouse doors, the bright sunlight hit him like a warm embrace. The chill of doubt and fear that had followed him for so long seemed to evaporate under its glow. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, and for the first time, he felt free. He tilted his head back, gazing up at the endless expanse of blue sky. "We did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the city around him. His words carried no bitterness, no anger, only relief and quiet triumph. The notebook remained clutched tightly to his chest as he descended the steps, each step feeling lighter than the last. Onlookers, some of whom had witnessed the trial, stood nearby, offering nods of respect or murmured words of congratulations. Their faces blurred together, a sea of kind strangers whose support buoyed him further. For Ethan, this moment was more than just a personal victory. It was proof that even the smallest voices, The ones most often dismissed or overlooked could make a difference. The courtroom had been his battleground, but the impact of what he had done extended far beyond its walls. As he reached the street, a light breeze ruffled his hair, carrying with it the faint scent of spring. Life, with all its challenges and uncertainties, stretched out before him. But Ethan Harper, the boy who had once been too small and too scared to believe he could stand up to someone like Langston, now knew better. He had fought for his family, for justice, and for the truth, and he had won. The smallest voices could indeed make the biggest impact, and today, Ethan's voice had echoed loud and clear. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and let us know in the comments which courtroom drama or legal battle you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.